There's no mistaking that the depiction of violence in cinema can certainly have an impact as to how a viewer will perceive film in general. This goes double for a film like American History X, which doesn't hesitate in capturing a raw brutality that never falters to anything remotely pornographic in its attempt at capturing a realism that is beyond sheer entertainment value. The opening scene of a muscled-up neo-Nazi, brilliantly played by Edward Norton, is merely the build-up to what is one of the most violently climactic and horrifying moments in cinema, as separated into different segments within the film. By now, it's fair to say that plenty of people have seen American History X since its 20-year release, and I don't think I'm crazy in saying that it isn't simply the subject matter of neo-Nazism that glues us to watching or rewatching this film over the course of the years following its release in 1998. Plenty of films have focused on discriminations towards blacks, Asians, or any other ethnicity alone, and they hold this power over American audiences that is both captivating and invigorating in the sense that we can't just look away. Now, why is that? Why do we gravitate towards hatred? And I say that even with regards to viewers who don't hold any bias whatsoever, especially when those films embody an attack towards the sort of xenophobic and racist hatred our culture frowns upon rather than a more biased piece of propaganda such as D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. But again, why does hatred attract those of us who do not fixate or hold much hate? Is it our own way of understanding its origins, or is it a way for better knowing ourselves? One thing is for certain. Everyone experiences hatred in some form or the other, and we all have our justifications for it without question. I think the main thing to take from a film like American History X is that just as much as a person can form hatred, they can just as willingly dispel it. This for certain is no easy task, given that hatred is far too intoxicating and undoubtedly tempting in comparison to that of love and the effort needed to embrace acceptance, even in the most difficult and challenging of circumstances. And by now, nobody can accuse human beings of being lazy when we really just choose the path of least resistance. The young neo-Nazi Derek Vineyard, who is portrayed with a powerhouse presence by Edward Norton, who for certain shows little resistance towards the anger that emboldened the false crusade of hatred he used to justify the death of his father, Dennis Vineyard, who served as a firefighter and who, while performing his duties in what is assumed to be a ghetto, or in the words of an angry and emotionally distraught Derek, a nigger neighborhood. Pardon my use of the N-word. However, while discussing a film as strong and as direct as American History X and its racial subject matter, I feel it is important to have an honest discussion without any sense of restraint, because at the end of the day, we can only approach subject matters as complex as these many racial divides we have been, and even to this day continue to experience in a culture that has only continued to become more divisive. It's no surprise that with the rise in presidential nomination of a man as belligerent and as discriminating as Donald Trump, that there has been an even greater surge of racially motivated crimes in the United States and across the world. I won't go on to say that Trump is the main cause, but there's certainly no denying that his rhetoric about Mexicans and migrants has certainly stirred and even amplified enough racial biases and tensions to create a resurgence of white nationalist-fueled hatred that very much mimics the same extremism within American History X. Derek Vineyard is no businessman or even a politician trying to assume some standing position of power. He is just a very intelligent boy with a great deal of blind anger, and that anger attracts the attention of Cameron Alexander, played by Stacy Keach, who is an equally charismatic white power propagandist who manipulates people like Derek and uses it to funnel his own bigot-ridden crusade. As to what Cameron's ultimate goals are in the film, they don't go any further than the mobilization and expansion of other white nationalist gangs within the state of California where the film is set. In fact, there is no ultimate goal in the film American History X, although told in a non-linear fashion, the film plays out like a simple tragedy, which centers around a man who allowed his own hatred to control him so much, that even when he gave it up and found peace within his heart, he only then realized the full extent of damage his blindness had created. Several years ago, I watched a film review by A Matter of Film which explained that American History X would very much be a very different film if it were told in complete chronological order. There's an element of truth to that, given that if the film were to be shown in such a way, then it would have ended up as a standard epic drama Excuse me again. Now, going back to what I was saying, there is an element of truth to that, given that if the film were to be shown in such a way where it was in chronological order, it would have ended up as a more standard epic drama about a man who falls from grace only to rise up again, and we've seen that plenty of times. I'm not saying that simultaneously introducing Derek at his worst and at his best doesn't get itself pose a risk to the narrative of the story. However, at the same time, I think that there is greater purpose towards this approach. Even though American History X is about Derek, it would be far too simple to say that he is the protagonist of the story. He is certainly the hero, but much too often, viewers and audiences confuse the terms hero and protagonist when they're intermingled. I mean, they can work hand in hand, but they mean totally different things. Webster just defines hero as a person admired for achievements and noble qualities, and they certainly fit Derek Vineyard in light of his willingness to conquer his hatred and anger. But he isn't the protagonist of American History X. His story, there is a segment of the story where it's told from his point of view, but that's like relatively late in the film and only for a short period of time in comparison to the more dominant narrative within the story of which we see it. The definition of a protagonist attributes more to the principal character, and by now I think it is safe to say that having an immoral central character is nothing new when looking to works like Breaking Bad, Death Note, or The Godfather trilogy. In the case of American History X, the story is told from the point of view of Derek's younger brother Danny Vineyard, who is played by Edward Furlong. And much like his brother Derek, Danny is well on his way to embracing the same path of hatred and unbridled bigotry that his brother embodies. He's also very intelligent like him, and yet equally confused in the cloud of hatred he often finds himself in. Early on in the film, Danny is sent to the principal's office for turning in a paper where he made the argument as to why Adolf Hitler was a civil rights hero. I know, and I feel that long pause I just gave justifies the definitive stupidity a title as ridiculous as that earned itself. I would be lying if I said I wasn't remotely curious as to what that paper said, given that it would grant a deeper look into the very mind that conceived and wrote down what even the most passionate of white supremacists would jerk off to. However, the film isn't about the politics. It certainly delves very deep into, and I bring this point up because one scene I find to be the most electrifying outside of the classic family dinner scene within American History X is the scene where Derek organizes a group of white supremacists, and he goes on a near 2 to 3 minute rant explaining how America has fallen from the grace many Americans feel it was entitled to in the beginning. The speech embraces the spirit of American exceptionalism that perfectly illustrates many, if not a great deal, of the hypocrisy that often overshadows much of the mass media and politics of Western culture. Derek's speech discusses the failures of government and the immigration policy many right-wing figures use as talking points for promoting their xenophobic agendas. And the most terrifying thing about the speech is that as unjustified and as ludicrous as it is very similar to what men like Donald Trump and other members of his administration have said about migrants entering the United States with the infusion of fear, mongering, a racist paranoia that only intensifies the fears many Americans are pressured to believe will come true if they allow themselves to feel compassion for people who by no fault of their own, weren't able to abide by a system that was inherently broken and to this day has become even more intolerant and draconian in its handling of immigrants entering the United States. Now, although I don't want to focus on the entirety of the review on the political points of a film like American History X because these often feel as just added bonuses meant to serve the major theme of hate, how it can lead to a near endless cycle with repercussions that can essentially become irreversible if unchecked, I think that they are still important to point out because they'll help give a better understanding of the characters' motivations and their own mindset. But this point brings me back to the protagonist of the story, Danny Vineyard, who, after being frowned upon for writing what was by far the craziest idea for a school paper, is tasked with writing another paper called American History X. No hint there, of course, but with the purpose of the paper being that of Danny's older brother, Derek, we can only see where this could potentially take Danny, given that although the time frame of American History X takes place over the course of several years, which covers Derek's prison incarceration, which resulted in him killing 2 black men, the present time frame of the story focuses on just one day following Derek's release from prison as he is newly reformed self, as well as Danny's perception of that overall change. As mentioned, the story of the film is told from the narration of its protagonist, Danny, who reflects on his family's life prior to and during and after Derek's gravitation towards his Nazism. And there's a sense of irony felt in those moments, given that before the narrations begin, we are introduced to the pre-Nazi Derek for a news interview where he is asked as to how he felt about his father's murder. Now, although this interview is made to be short and to simply give us a glimpse of the emotional distraught and hatred Derek feels, we only get a full understanding how these types of tendencies are made in Derek's mind. And this is only discovered within Danny's narration, where he reminisces on another family dinner within the film that, although isn't as explosive as the more iconic scene where Derek fully shows the full extent of his hatred towards his mother's Jewish boyfriend played by Elliot Gould, it fully illustrates how racist hatred can very much be born from the simple little pushes we tend to ignore. This is the only scene where we are introduced to Derek's father, Dennis Vineyard, played by William Russ from Boy Meets World. What starts off as a simple family dinner where they are talking about the casual stuff most American families find no harm in, it essentially turns into a racial discussion. It isn't as direct as Rodney King, which was the subject of the other dinner scene, but a lot can most certainly be said when Derek's father learns that his son is reading a story like Native Son, which focuses on a black protagonist. For those of you who don't know about Native Son, it is written by Richard Wright, and it's a book I highly recommend. I'll even put a link down below for Amazon of who can purchase it, because it is a very dark story, a very tragic story, and I highly recommend it. But anyway, going back to talking about American History X, when Derek mentions the story of Native Son and how it centers on a black protagonist, I mean, the mere fact that the main character of the story is black, it manages to trigger a reaction from his father, which, although doesn't end up being violent or even aggressive, there's certainly enough subtlety. There is certainly a lack of subtlety within his speech that he gives about his problem with the rise of black culture, or affirmative blaction, as he terms it, within Western society to show that he has his own racial biases. Which, again, although they're small in comparison to that of a raving lunatic like Cameron Alexander or David, or your typical David Duke, they still hold the potential for creating a cycle of hatred which can only become more amplified if left unreflected. And that is when I feel American History X functions at its strongest level of sophistication, despite how underrated that scene is. The idea of the film's present timeline being resolved over the course of a day isn't unrealistic, but it certainly feels like it has some level of absurdism, given that the pattern feels like Danny's inner resolution could have come over a much longer period of time. Now, I don't think I'm the best critic of this particular critique of the film, given that I myself haven't reached a definitive level of resolution outside of the fact that it is just one potential flaw. I mean, I still think the non-linear narrative mixed with the voiceover narration works very well within the framework of the story, because it allows us to have a documentation of Danny's mindset as well as the progression it slowly undergoes over the course of his own inner reflections when concerning his elder brother and what he initially feels about him and has felt about him over the years that he's seen him change for better and worse. But yeah, one last point I want to bring up about that dinner scene with Dennis Vineyard. I think it is underrated. I mean, Boy Meets World would have certainly been a different show with that type of father that William Ross played. It certainly would have made it interesting. I'm just joking, but on a more serious note, the fact that those are things we often see in families that we don't pay attention to, because there are plenty of young people who are very open-minded and progressive that probably come from conservative families, and although they would never say their families are racist, they hold certain biases which can, if unmitigated, can become more aggressive. And the fact that when Dennis Vineyard uses reverse psychology to get his son to think open-mindedly, acting as though the idea of black culture rising is a form of oppression, and he even openly says I'll say the N-word again, pardon me, but I feel that it is warranted, it's nigger bullshit, openly shows that even though he isn't like as dogmatic as the lunatic you see waving a flag or marching in front of a white nationalist parade, you get the idea that if he was pushed enough, he would openly yell out that word with the kind of vicious hatred you rarely see. I mean, I'm going to go off a little point. There's a scene from the TV series The Sopranos where this modern American family is robbed by two gangbangers who happen to be black. and they work for Tony Soprano, the character played by the late James Gandolfini. And the moment they lose their fancy Mercedes SUV, and their dog runs away, which I don't blame him, because they were terrible people, very empty and stupid. The father basically just takes a moment and he just says F. I'm not going to say the N word with effing, but effing and N word. And with such vicious vitriol that you rarely see. I mean, it was just horrifying. It was funny how ridiculous he looked, but he said it with such vile hatred that I can see that in people like Dennis Vineyard or the person who, although isn't a typical racist, the fact that they hold those biases and don't reflect on them can still be very dangerous. Now, aside from Danny's narrations at the near midpoint of the film, Derek Vineyard is granted the chance to have his own voiceover narration, which I discussed earlier, and in this segment he explains to Danny what caused him to dispel his Nazi sympathies and adopt a more peacefully oriented approach. Now, Derek's time in prison is never rushed, and it is documented in a realistic fashion where at first it seems like he is simply riding through the very motions of the process, as he starts out by befriending the Aryan Brotherhood members as the perfect survival tactic to handle the fact that being a skinhead in a prison was pretty much him being a walking target. Over the course of his stay in prison, Derek slowly begins to change as he befriends an African-American inmate who he works with, Lamont. Derek's descent from Nazism doesn't just happen as a result of his friendship with Lamont when it occurs more so as a result of him recognizing the inherent hypocrisies within the Brotherhood members he first put up a flag for. The final nail, though, comes when Derek is viciously raped by the same Brotherhood members for his association with Lamont. After that comes Derek's process of recovery, as he is visited by his old African-American teacher and now principal of his school, Robert Sweeney, who is brilliantly played by Avery Brooks, and he embodies the wisdom of a mentor you rarely see in cinema. And this is made very clear in the beginning when he refused to give up on Danny rather than expel him for the blatant bigotry he expressed in the paper he turned in, where he argued that Adolf Hitler was a civil rights hero, which is absolutely ridiculous. In watching the character of Dr. Bob Sweeney, who also works as an outreach worker, I felt this rather electrifying sensation because of the presence of his character, which can no doubt be attributed to the charisma that an actor as talented as Avery Brooks embodies. And it actually makes his scenes where he literally propels Edward Norton's character to change more convincing, because in a lot of films that involved a very confused and aimless and morally mixed protagonist, the mentor character is often used in a more superficial rather than believable fashion, which actually sometimes stereotypes the archetype as a way, which is something I don't really like. I don't see that type of compromise within the character or the performance Avery Brooks has within his character Bob Sweeney, when he himself goes on to talk about his own past failings during his more youthful years. I mean, there's a quote where Bob Sweeney says, "There was a moment like this when I used to blame everything and everyone for all the pain and suffering and vile things that happened to me, that I saw happen to my people. I used to blame everybody, blamed white people, blamed the society, blamed God. I didn't get no answers because I was asking the wrong questions. You have to ask the right questions." It's a quote like this that, along with the question of whether anything Derek had done had made his life better, that essentially makes this mentor more believable, if not more compelling, in his attempts to put Derek on the right path. And that path goes simply beyond that of self-reformation. One thing among the many things I personally admire about American History X, aside from the courage and conviction it shows in depicting the racially charged nature of its subject matter, is that it fully embraces the complete extent of its theme of hatred and how that can essentially fuel a cycle with limitless possibilities. And this goes far beyond the very beginning of the film when Danny turns in his Mein Kampf paper, because even after being frowned upon for pushing his white power propaganda, Danny decided to antagonize a group of African Americans, which would sadly lead to his own undoing at the very end of the film when he is brutally gunned down just moments after saying goodbye to a brother he felt he was truly getting to know and learn from for the better. But sadly, American History X as a film understands the brutal reality that behind the very cycle of hatred that fuels what now feels like a war that continues to this day in the rise of white supremacy in both the U.S. and the world. It's no coincidence that there has, as I mentioned, that there has been a rise of hate crimes over the course of Trump's presidency. Now, I'm not saying that Trump is a direct result, given that this rise has covered a global scale since the year 2011, which includes incidents like the bomb attack of the youth camp of Norway's Labour Party in July 2011, or the murder of Labour MP Joe Cox by a white supremacist. However, it is important to take into account that there has in fact been a rise of white supremacist groups, particularly around the United States before and during that of Trump's time in office, where in certain instances the attackers have echoed the same rhetoric about their fears of immigrant invasions, similar to that of the platform Trump ran on back when he announced his candidacy. Seeing these types of events unfold truly shows not only how raw hatred can be, but just how much more it can expand when left unchecked. And that is a lesson Derek Vineyard learned too little too late, after believing that just because he had let go of his own hatred and racial biases, he could simply walk away without confronting the very past that nearly destroyed him and the family he had hoped to fix. Because near the end of the film, you learn that both Cameron Alexander and a former associate of Derek from his white nationalist group are assaulted by African Americans, and they're left in critical condition. And even though they'll live, Derek is asked by Bob Sweeney and a police chief to talk with them just to help the situation, because they don't want an all-out war. Because these cycles of hatred don't just end in little spouts; they expand into greater conflicts of violence. And Derek does express a reluctance, but he also decides to help. But again, this reluctance is in a way where it's pressured on him, because he doesn't fully realize the full extent of the situation. And that is probably the saddest part, because you'd think that with a film like American History X, which is about conquering hatred, I'll have a more positive ending. But as I mentioned, it's about depicting that brutal reality as a way of teaching a lesson. I mean, I don't know what the original ending of American History X was going to be, because I know that Edward Norton interfered with the writing of the script by editing his own version, and the film we saw was the version he edited, from what I've heard or done in my research. And I think it was for the better, because if American History X had had a more positive ending, it probably wouldn't have been as remembered as or held up as much as it is today, because obviously this film was made at a very low budget. Now, going back to the story, I mean, I can't say that American History X is not a perfect film. I don't think it is. I wouldn't call it a masterpiece. But it is a very rare and uniquely impactful film that works well in depicting the reality and the end result that blind and unmitigated hatred can create, when love and understanding can usher in so much more. And I think it's important that anybody who does care about these issues check out American History X, because I think especially now in times where our culture is more racially divided and becoming even more divisive as time goes on, especially with the issue of COVID-19 and how African Americans are being the most affected by this pandemic, and that's because of the systematic oppression that puts them in lower living conditions doesn't address. I think people should watch this film and understand that any racial biases they have can be dispelled, because even though it's difficult to get rid of hate, it's much better to have love and acceptance rather than to give in to the temptation hatred often blinds us with.